In the heart of Washington, D.C., terror walked the streets in broad daylight. For 23 days in October 2002, two shadows moved through the nation's capital like ghosts, turning everyday moments into potential death sentences. A man pumping gas, a woman loading groceries, a child walking to school. Each could be the next target of invisible killers who struck without warning, without pattern, without mercy. The Beltway snipers had paralyzed a city of millions. Police sirens wailed constantly. Schools locked down. People zigzagged through parking lots, desperate to avoid straight lines that might offer a clean shot. The media called them unstoppable. The FBI's best profilers were stumped. 10 people were already dead, and 3 more lay wounded in hospital beds. But in a small police station in Tacoma, Washington, a determined detective named Kathy Scott refused to accept that these killers were untouchable. While the nation's top investigators chased shadows on the East Coast, she quietly pieced together a puzzle that would change everything. Her discovery wouldn't come from advanced forensics or high-tech surveillance. It would come from something far more powerful: the courage to listen when others chose to ignore, and the relentless drive to seek justice for victims whose voices had been silenced. This is the true story of how one woman's unwavering determination brought down the most feared serial killers in American history. It's a story about the power of believing survivors, the importance of connecting seemingly unrelated crimes, and the extraordinary impact one person can have when they refuse to give up. The snipers thought they were invisible. They were wrong. The morning of October 2, 2002 started like any other Wednesday in Montgomery County, Maryland. James Martin had already dropped his stepson off at school and was now at the Shoppers Food Warehouse on Georgia Avenue, loading groceries into his truck. The 55-year-old program analyst for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had no idea that someone was watching him through a rifle scope from 150 yards away. At 6:04 p.m., a single shot echoed across the parking lot. Martin collapsed beside his white Mazda pickup truck, struck by a bullet that had traveled with deadly precision. Shoppers screamed and scattered. Within minutes, police cars surrounded the area, but the shooter had vanished without a trace. Detective Kathy Scott was 2,800 miles away in Tacoma, Washington when the news broke. She was wrapping up paperwork on a domestic violence case when her colleague mentioned the shooting. At that moment, it seemed like just another tragic incident in a world already full of violence. She had no way of knowing that this single gunshot would eventually lead her on a journey that would make her one of the most important investigators in American criminal history. The next morning brought horror beyond imagination. At 7:41 a.m., James Buchanan was mowing the grass at Fitzgerald Auto Mall in Rockville when a bullet found him. Less than an hour later, Prem Kumar Walakar was filling his taxi with gas at a mobile station when death struck again. At 8:37 a.m., Sarah Ramos was sitting on a bench outside a post office in Silver Spring, reading a book, when the invisible killer claimed another victim. By 9:58 a.m., Lorianne Lewis Rivera had become the 5th victim, shot while vacuuming her van at a Shell station in Kensington. 5 people dead in less than 16 hours. All shot with a single bullet. All killed by someone they never saw coming. The Washington, D.C. metropolitan area erupted into panic. Police Chief Charles Moose of Montgomery County found himself at the center of the most intense manhunt in recent memory. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit descended on the region, setting up a joint command center that would eventually involve more than 1,000 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. But even as the investigation ramped up, the killer struck again. On October 3rd, Pascal Charlotte was walking along Georgia Avenue in Washington, D.C. When he was shot and critically wounded, the bullet had missed vital organs by inches, giving investigators their first surviving victim. However, Charlotte could provide no description of his attacker. Like all the others, he never saw it coming. The randomness of the attacks terrified everyone. These weren't crimes of passion or targeted assassinations. The victims came from different backgrounds, different ages, different races. They were killed while doing the most ordinary things: shopping, working, walking down the street. The only thing they had in common was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meanwhile, 2,800 miles away in Tacoma, Detective Kathy Scott was dealing with her own challenges. As one of the few female detectives in a male-dominated police force, she had spent years proving herself worthy of respect. Her colleagues knew her as someone who never gave up on a case, no matter how cold it got or how impossible it seemed. Scott had grown up in a working-class family where giving up wasn't an option. Her father had worked double shifts at a factory to support his family, and her mother had cleaned houses to make ends meet. They had taught her that hard work and persistence could overcome any obstacle. This lesson had served her well in police work, where she had solved cases that others had written off as unsolvable. Her specialty was connecting dots that others missed. While other investigators focused on the obvious evidence, Scott had a talent for finding patterns in seemingly unrelated information. She had solved domestic violence cases by linking them to previous incidents that had been filed away and forgotten. She had caught burglars by noticing similarities in their methods across different neighborhoods. Her ability to see connections where others saw chaos had made her one of Tacoma's most successful detectives. But even Scott was unprepared for what was happening on the East Coast. The Beltway sniper attacks were unlike anything in American criminal history. The killers seemed to strike without warning, without pattern, and without leaving any useful evidence behind. The investigation in Maryland was consuming enormous resources. Hundreds of tips poured in every day, but none led to concrete results. The FBI's profilers worked around the clock, trying to understand the psychology of killers who seemed to have no clear motive. Was this terrorism? A serial killer seeking attention? Someone with a grudge against society? The media coverage was intense and constant. News trucks lined the streets around the command center. Reporters provided live updates throughout the day, analyzing every piece of information that was released to the public. The story dominated newspaper headlines and television broadcasts across the country, but the attention only seemed to encourage the killers. On October 4th, Caroline Sewell was loading purchases into her minivan at a Michael's craft store in Fredericksburg, Virginia, when she was shot and wounded. The attack had expanded beyond the D.C. area, showing that the killers were mobile and willing to travel to find victims. Schools throughout the region went into lockdown mode. Children were kept inside during recess. Parents drove their kids to school instead of letting them walk or take the bus. Football games were cancelled. Outdoor events were postponed. The entire region lived in fear of the next attack. The pressure on law enforcement was enormous. Politicians demanded results. The media asked pointed questions about why the killers hadn't been caught. Families of victims pleaded for justice. But despite all the resources and expertise focused on the case, the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. Part of the problem was the lack of useful evidence at the crime scenes. The killers fired from long distances, then disappeared before anyone could spot them. They left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could provide descriptions. The bullets recovered from victims and crime scenes were all fired from the same rifle, but that only confirmed what investigators already knew, that the same person or persons were responsible for all the attacks. The FBI's psychological profile suggested they were looking for a white male in his 20s or 30s, probably acting alone, seeking attention through his crimes. This profile was based on decades of research into serial killers and seemed to match the pattern of attacks. But like everything else in the investigation, it led nowhere. Detective Scott followed the news coverage with growing concern. She had worked enough violent crime cases to understand how difficult it could be to catch killers who planned their attacks carefully and left little evidence behind. But something about the Beltway sniper case bothered her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just the randomness of the attacks or the skill of the shooters. There was something about the whole situation that reminded her of other cases she had worked, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what it was. She found herself paying close attention to every detail reported in the news, looking for patterns that the investigators on the scene might have missed. Her colleagues in Tacoma thought she was becoming obsessed with a case that had nothing to do with their jurisdiction. They teased her about watching too much CNN and reading too many newspaper articles about the shootings. But Scott had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and her instincts were telling her that there was more to the story than anyone realized. On October 7th, the case took another tragic turn. Iran Brown, a 13-year-old middle school student, was shot as he arrived at Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland. The boy survived, but was critically injured. The attack on a child sent shockwaves through the community and intensified the already enormous pressure on investigators. The shooting at the school also provided new evidence. Witnesses reported seeing a white van leaving the area shortly after the attack. Police immediately began searching for white vans throughout the region, stopping thousands of vehicles and questioning their drivers. But like everything else in the investigation, this lead seemed to go nowhere. What investigators didn't know was that they were actually looking for a blue Chevrolet Caprice, not a white van. The killers had been using the car as a mobile shooting platform, with one of them firing through a hole they had cut in the trunk while the other drove. They would park the car, take their shot, and drive away before anyone could identify the source of the gunfire. The sophistication of their operation was impressive and terrifying. They had planned everything carefully, from choosing shooting locations with good escape routes to timing their attacks to avoid detection. They communicated with each other using walkie-talkies, and had studied their targets before striking. This wasn't random violence. It was methodical and calculated. But while the killers thought they had covered all their bases, they had made one crucial mistake. Their shooting spree hadn't started in the DC area. It had begun months earlier, thousands of miles away, in a place where a determined detective was about to make a connection that would change everything. Detective Scott continued to follow the case obsessively, clipping newspaper articles and recording television reports. She had filled an entire file folder with information about the attacks, studying the details like a student preparing for the most important test of her life. Her colleagues thought she had lost her mind, but Scott knew she was onto something important. She just didn't know what it was yet. The breakthrough would come from an unexpected source, not from the massive investigation in Maryland, but from a case file sitting in her own office, gathering dust while the entire nation focused on events 3,000 miles away. Sometimes the most important clues are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right perspective to notice them. Detective Kathy Scott was about to become that someone. Detective Kathy Scott's obsession with the Beltway sniper case was starting to worry her family. Her husband found her at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by newspaper clippings and printouts from news websites, creating timelines and studying maps of the attack locations. Her children complained that she seemed distracted during dinner, her mind clearly elsewhere even when her body was present. But Scott couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. She had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when her subconscious was trying to tell her something, even if her rational mind hadn't caught up yet. There was a pattern here. She was certain of it. But it remained just out of reach. The investigation in Maryland was entering its second week with little progress to show for it. Despite the involvement of hundreds of investigators and the expenditure of millions of dollars, the killers remained as mysterious as ever. If anything, they seemed to be growing bolder. On October 9th, Dean Harold Myers was shot and killed while filling his car with gas at a Sunoco station in Manassas, Virginia. The 53-year-old civil engineer had been traveling home from business when he stopped for fuel. Like all the previous victims, he never saw his killer. The shot came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the brightly lit gas station, fired with deadly accuracy from a distance that made detection nearly impossible. The killing of Myers marked a new phase in the attacks. The killers were no longer confining themselves to the immediate Washington, D.C. area. They were ranging farther afield, striking in Virginia, and showing that nowhere in the region was safe from their reach. This expansion of their hunting ground made the investigation even more complex, requiring coordination between multiple state and local jurisdictions. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was struggling to understand the psychology behind the attacks. Traditional serial killer profiles didn't seem to fit the pattern. These weren't crimes of sexual violence or personal revenge. The victims weren't chosen for any characteristic beyond being available targets. The killers seemed motivated by something that existing criminal psychology couldn't explain adequately. Dr. James Fitzgerald, one of the FBI's most experienced profilers, spent hours studying the crime scenes and victim information. He had worked on some of the most notorious serial killer cases in American history, but the Beltway snipers presented unique challenges. Their method of operation was unlike anything he had encountered before. Most serial killers had a preferred victim type and a consistent method of killing. They often took trophies from their victims or engaged in ritualistic behavior that provided psychological satisfaction. But the Beltway snipers seemed almost businesslike in their approach. They killed efficiently and moved on, showing no apparent interest in the personal details of their victims' lives. The randomness of the attacks was particularly puzzling. Serial killers usually chose victims who fit some kind of psychological need or fantasy. But these killers seemed to select targets based purely on opportunity and tactical considerations. Gas stations provided open sight lines and multiple escape routes. Parking lots offered cover for the shooters while exposing victims. Schools and public buildings created high-profile targets that would generate maximum media attention. Meanwhile, Detective Scott's investigation had taken an unexpected turn. While reviewing old case files in her office, she had come across a report that had been gathering dust for months. It concerned a shooting that had occurred in Tacoma the previous February, but it had been filed away as an isolated incident with no apparent connection to other crimes. The case involved a 21-year-old woman named Kenya Cook, who had been shot and killed outside a restaurant in Tacoma's Hilltop neighborhood. Cook had been walking to her car after finishing her shift as a server when someone fired at her from a distance. The single shot had been fatal, and the killer had disappeared without being identified or caught. At the time, investigating detectives had assumed Cook's murder was related to local gang activity or a personal dispute. The Hilltop neighborhood had a reputation for violence, and random shootings were unfortunately common enough that one more didn't attract unusual attention. The case had been investigated thoroughly, but had gone cold when no witnesses or evidence could be found. But as Scott read through the file again, details began jumping out at her that she hadn't noticed before. The shooting had occurred from a distance, with the killer firing a single, precisely placed shot. The victim had been chosen apparently at random, with no connection to the shooter. The killer had escaped without being seen or leaving useful evidence behind. The similarities to the Beltway sniper attacks were striking, but Scott knew that coincidences were common in police work. Shootings happened every day across America, and some similarities between cases were inevitable. She needed more evidence before she could seriously consider a connection between a shooting in Tacoma and the terror campaign gripping the East Coast. That evidence came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the Cook case file, Scott noticed that the investigating detective had noted the presence of a suspicious vehicle in the area around the time of the shooting. A witness had reported seeing a dark-colored sedan driving slowly through the neighborhood shortly before the gunshots were heard. The witness hadn't gotten a clear look at the license plate or the people inside the car, but they had thought the behavior was unusual enough to mention to police. This detail hadn't seemed important at the time. Lots of cars drove through the Hilltop neighborhood every day, and the description was too vague to be useful in identifying a suspect. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and knowledge about the Beltway attacks, Scott began to wonder if that dark sedan might have been more significant than anyone had realized. She pulled out a map of Tacoma and marked the location where Kenya Cook had been killed. Then she began searching through other unsolved shooting cases from around the same time period, looking for similar patterns. What she found made her heart race with excitement and dread. There had been 2 other random shootings in the Tacoma area during the early months of 2002. Both had involved single shots fired from a distance at victims who appeared to have been chosen randomly. Both had resulted in deaths. Both had been investigated as isolated incidents with no apparent connections to other crimes. The first had occurred on January 16, 2002, when a 54-year-old man named Jerry Taylor was shot and killed outside a restaurant where he worked as a cook. Taylor had been taking out trash when someone fired at him from across the street. The shot was fatal, and the killer escaped without being identified. The second shooting had happened on February 16th, exactly 1 month later. A 22-year-old man named Marcus Parks had been shot and killed while walking home from work in the early morning hours. Like the other victims, Parks had no connection to his killer and no apparent reason to be targeted for violence. Scott spread the case files across her desk and studied them carefully. 3 victims, all killed by single shots fired from a distance. All targeted randomly while going about ordinary activities. All killed by someone who disappeared without leaving useful evidence behind. The pattern was undeniable, but Scott knew she needed to be careful about jumping to conclusions. Police work required evidence, not hunches, and she didn't have enough concrete proof to link these cases to the Beltway attacks definitively. But her instincts were screaming that she had found something important. She decided to dig deeper into the background of the Tacoma shootings. If these cases were connected to the Beltway snipers, there might be other evidence that previous investigators had overlooked. She began by re-interviewing witnesses from all 3 cases, hoping to find details that might have been missed the first time around. The process was frustrating and time-consuming. Many of the witnesses had moved away or were reluctant to talk about traumatic events from months earlier. Those who were willing to speak often had conflicting memories or couldn't provide useful new information. But Scott persisted, driven by her growing certainty that she was onto something crucial. The breakthrough came when she spoke with Maria Gonzalez, a woman who had been working at a convenience store near where Marcus Parks was killed. Gonzalez had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation but hadn't been considered an important witness because she hadn't seen the actual shooting. But when Scott questioned her more thoroughly, Gonzalez remembered something that hadn't been included in the original police report. About an hour before Parks was killed, she had noticed 2 men in a dark blue car parked across from the store. The men had seemed to be watching the area, and their behavior had made her uncomfortable. Gonzalez described one of the men as older, possibly in his 40s, with a serious expression and military bearing. The other was much younger, perhaps a teenager, and seemed to defer to the older man. They had sat in the car for about 20 minutes before driving away, and Gonzalez had forgotten about the incident until Parks was found shot nearby. This was the first eyewitness description of potential suspects in any of the Tacoma shootings. Scott felt her pulse quicken as she took detailed notes about the men and their vehicle. If these were the killers, she now had descriptions that could be compared to evidence from the Beltway attacks. But even more important was what Gonzalez told her next. The older man had gotten out of the car at one point to throw away some trash in a dumpster behind the store. Security cameras had captured the entire area, including the dumpster, but the recordings from that night had been erased during routine maintenance weeks later. However, Gonzalez mentioned that the store manager had mentioned finding something unusual in the dumpster the next morning. Someone had thrown away a military-style jacket that seemed too new and expensive to be discarded. The manager had been puzzled by the find but hadn't connected it to the shooting that had occurred nearby. Scott's excitement was building, but she forced herself to remain methodical. She needed to gather all available evidence before making any conclusions or sharing her suspicions with other investigators. Too many cases had been damaged by premature publicity or rushed conclusions. She spent the next several days tracking down every possible lead from the Tacoma shootings. She interviewed store clerks, restaurant workers, and residents who might have seen something unusual around the times of the attacks. She reviewed traffic camera footage and cell phone records. She examined ballistics evidence and crime scene photographs with fresh eyes. Gradually, a picture began to emerge that made Scott increasingly confident in her theory. The Tacoma shootings had all the hallmarks of the Beltway attacks, just on a smaller scale. Single shots from long distances, random victims with no connection to their killers. Professional execution with careful planning and swift escapes. But Scott also realized that she was facing a major challenge. How could she convince investigators 3,000 miles away that a small-town detective in Washington state had discovered a crucial piece of evidence in the nation's most high-profile manhunt? The FBI and other federal agencies involved in the Beltway investigation were dealing with thousands of tips and leads every day. Most of them turned out to be worthless. Scott knew she would need more than theories and coincidences to get their attention. She would need concrete evidence that even the most skeptical investigator couldn't ignore. And she was about to find exactly that kind of evidence in the most unlikely place imaginable. The key would come from understanding not just what the killers had done in Tacoma, but why they had been there in the first place. And that story was even more shocking than Scott had imagined. Detective Kathy Scott's investigation took a dramatic turn when she decided to look beyond the random shootings and examine what had brought the suspects to Tacoma in the first place. Her research into military records and local databases led her to a discovery that would change everything: the connection between the shootings and a bitter custody dispute that had turned deadly. The story began with John Allen Muhammad, a 41-year-old Army veteran who had been living in Tacoma with his 3 children following a messy divorce from his wife Mildred. Muhammad had seemed like a devoted father to his neighbors, often seen playing with his kids in the yard or walking them to school. But beneath the surface, he was consumed with rage over losing custody of his children when Mildred moved across the country to Maryland. Court records painted a picture of a man whose life had spiraled out of control. Muhammad had been struggling financially since leaving the army, moving from job to job and falling behind on child support payments. When Mildred was awarded primary custody and moved to the Washington, D.C. area with the children, Muhammad's anger had turned to obsession. Scott discovered that Muhammad had been making increasingly threatening phone calls to his ex-wife throughout 2001 and early 2002. Mildred had contacted police several times, reporting that Muhammad had threatened to kill her and take the children. But each time, officers had found no evidence of immediate danger, and Muhammad had been careful to keep his threats vague enough to avoid serious criminal charges. The custody battle had intensified in the months before the Tacoma shootings began. Muhammad had been fighting to regain custody through the courts, but his case was weak due to his financial instability and history of domestic violence. Mildred had obtained a restraining order against him, and social workers had recommended that his visitation rights be limited. It was during this period that Muhammad had met Lee Boyd Malvo, a 17-year-old Jamaican immigrant who had been living illegally in the United States. Malvo was staying with his mother in Tacoma when he encountered Muhammad at a homeless shelter where both were receiving services. The teenager was vulnerable and looking for direction, while Muhammad was searching for someone he could manipulate and control. Their relationship had developed quickly, with Muhammad taking on a father-like role in Malvo's life. The older man provided the teenager with food, shelter, and a sense of belonging that had been missing from his chaotic upbringing. In return, Malvo gave Muhammad the loyalty and obedience he craved. But Muhammad's influence on Malvo was far from benevolent. He began filling the teenager's head with extremist ideology, teaching him to hate America and Americans. He spoke constantly about getting revenge against a society that had taken away his children and destroyed his life. Gradually, Muhammad had transformed the impressionable teenager into a weapon for his own twisted purposes. Scott's investigation revealed that the random shootings in Tacoma hadn't been random at all. They had been practice sessions, training exercises designed to prepare Malvo for a much larger mission. Muhammad had been teaching the teenager how to kill efficiently and escape without detection. Each shooting had been a lesson in marksmanship, stealth, and psychological warfare. The choice of victims in Tacoma had been deliberate as well. Muhammad had selected targets that resembled the kinds of people he blamed for his troubles. Working-class Americans going about their daily lives, representing the society he felt had rejected him. The murders had served a dual purpose, training Malvo and satisfying Muhammad's need for revenge. But the Tacoma shootings had been just the beginning. Muhammad's ultimate plan was far more ambitious and terrifying. He intended to take his war against American society to the place where it had all started, the Washington, D.C. area, where his ex-wife was living with his children. The plan, as Scott began to piece it together from evidence and witness statements, was breathtakingly evil in its scope. Muhammad didn't just want to kill random Americans. He wanted to create such terror and chaos that normal life would become impossible. He wanted to make people afraid to leave their homes, to go to work, to send their children to school. The psychological warfare aspect of the attacks was crucial to Muhammad's strategy. By targeting ordinary people engaged in routine activities, he was sending a message that no one was safe anywhere. The randomness of the victim selection was designed to maximize fear because it meant that anyone could be next. Muhammad had also planned to use the media attention generated by the attacks to communicate directly with law enforcement and the public. He saw himself as a soldier in a war against American society, and he wanted his enemies to know they were under attack by someone who understood their weaknesses and fears. The selection of the Washington, D.C. area as the primary target zone was not coincidental. Muhammad knew the region well from his time in the military, and he understood that attacks there would receive maximum national attention. The proximity to federal government buildings and military installations would add extra psychological impact to each shooting. But there was another, more personal reason for choosing the D.C. area. Muhammad's ex-wife Mildred was living there with their children, and he was obsessed with the idea of getting them back. Some investigators would later theorize that the entire sniper campaign was designed to create enough chaos and confusion that Muhammad could kidnap his children without being detected. Scott's research into Muhammad's background revealed a man whose life had been marked by increasingly erratic and violent behavior. Military records showed that he had been disciplined multiple times for insubordination and aggressive conduct toward other soldiers. Former colleagues described him as angry and unpredictable, someone who held grudges and blamed others for his failures. His marriage to Mildred had been troubled from the beginning, marked by frequent arguments and incidents of domestic violence. Friends and family members had urged Mildred to leave Muhammad years before she finally did, but she had been afraid of what he might do if she tried to take the children away from him. When she finally did leave, moving across the country with the kids, Muhammad's behavior had become increasingly obsessive. He had hired private investigators to track her movements, and had made multiple trips to the East Coast trying to locate her and the children. Court records showed that he had violated the restraining order numerous times, showing up at her workplace and her children's school. The transformation of Lee Boyd Malvo from a troubled teenager into Muhammad's accomplice was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire story. Malvo had been vulnerable to manipulation, desperate for guidance and acceptance from an adult who seemed to care about him. Muhammad had exploited that vulnerability expertly, gradually indoctrinating the teenager with his extremist beliefs. The process had been methodical and calculated. Muhammad had started by providing Malvo with basic necessities, food, clothing, shelter, that the teenager couldn't get elsewhere. Then he had begun the psychological manipulation, teaching Malvo to see himself as a soldier in a righteous war against an evil society. Muhammad had used a combination of isolation, indoctrination, and intimidation to control Malvo completely. He had cut the teenager off from other relationships, making himself the sole source of guidance and approval in Malvo's life. He had filled Malvo's head with conspiracy theories and extremist ideology, teaching him to hate the country and people around him. The firearms training had come gradually, presented as necessary preparation for the war they were going to fight together. Muhammad had taught Malvo how to handle various weapons, how to shoot accurately at long distances, and how to remain calm under pressure. The teenager had been an apt pupil, quickly developing the skills that would make him a deadly sniper. But perhaps most importantly, Muhammad had taught Malvo to see their victims as enemies rather than human beings. He had dehumanized the targets, describing them as representatives of a corrupt system that needed to be destroyed. This psychological preparation had been essential to enabling the teenager to kill without hesitation or remorse. The relationship between Muhammad and Malvo was complex and disturbing. Mohammed had positioned himself as both father figure and commanding officer, demanding absolute loyalty and obedience from the teenager. Malvo, desperate for acceptance and guidance, had given Mohammed complete control over his life and actions. This dynamic had made their partnership particularly dangerous. Mohammed provided the strategic planning and psychological motivation, while Malvo served as the primary shooter. The older man's military training and experience had complemented the teenager's natural marksmanship abilities, creating a deadly combination. As Scott continued her investigation, she began to understand that the Beltway sniper attacks were not the work of a traditional serial killer or terrorist group. They were the product of one man's personal rage and desire for revenge, amplified and enabled by his manipulation of a vulnerable teenager. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Scott was right, then the entire FBI profile of the attackers was wrong. They weren't looking for a lone white male in his 20s or 30s. They were looking for a middle-aged black man and his teenage accomplice. Men who had been practicing their deadly skills on the streets of Tacoma months before the terror began on the East Coast. But Scott knew that her theory, however compelling, was still just that. A theory. She needed concrete evidence that would convince investigators to take her seriously. She needed proof that John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were the Beltway snipers. That proof was about to come from the most unexpected source imaginable, the killers themselves, who were growing overconfident and beginning to make the kinds of mistakes that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The endgame was approaching, and Detective Kathy Scott was about to play the most important role of her career in bringing two of America's most dangerous killers to justice. Detective Kathy Scott knew she was sitting on potentially explosive information, but she also understood that she needed to proceed carefully. Her theory about John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo being the Beltway snipers was based on solid investigative work, but it was still largely circumstantial. She needed more concrete evidence before she could convince federal investigators to take her seriously. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Muhammad himself. His need for attention and recognition was becoming stronger as the attacks continued, and he began making mistakes that would ultimately lead to his capture. On October 13th, the snipers struck again, this time targeting Dean Harold Myers at a gas station in Manassas, Virginia. But this attack was different from the others. The killers left behind a tarot card with a message written on it, "Dear policeman, I am God." The card also contained a demand for money and threats of more violence if their demands weren't met. This direct communication with law enforcement marked a new phase in the attacks. Muhammad was no longer content to remain anonymous. He wanted the world to know that he was in control, that he was the one terrorizing an entire region. This need for recognition would prove to be his undoing. Back in Tacoma, Scott was working around the clock to build her case against Muhammad and Malvo. She had contacted the Army to request Muhammad's complete military file, including his training records and psychological evaluations. What she found confirmed her worst fears about the man's potential for violence. Muhammad's military record showed a soldier with excellent marksmanship skills, but serious discipline problems. He had been trained as a mechanic and truck driver, but had also received extensive weapons training during his service. More importantly, he had been stationed at Fort Lewis, just outside Tacoma, which explained his familiarity with the area. The psychological evaluations were particularly revealing. Military psychiatrists had noted Muhammad's tendency toward paranoid thinking and his difficulty accepting authority. They had documented his explosive temper and his tendency to blame others for his problems. One evaluation had recommended against promoting him due to concerns about his mental stability. Scott also discovered that Muhammad had been investigated by military police for several incidents during his service. He had been accused of threatening fellow soldiers, stealing equipment, and making inappropriate comments about violence against Americans. While he had never been court-martialed, his superiors had clearly been concerned about his behavior. But the most damning evidence came from Muhammad's civilian life after leaving the Army. Scott tracked down his former employers, neighbors, and acquaintances, painting a picture of a man whose anger and instability had only grown worse over time. Several people described Muhammad as obsessed with his ex-wife and children. He had talked constantly about getting revenge on the system that had taken them away from him. He had made increasingly violent threats, though always stopping just short of anything that would result in serious criminal charges. More importantly, multiple witnesses could place Muhammad and Malvo together in Tacoma during the period when the random shootings occurred. A homeless shelter worker remembered the pair staying there for several weeks. A gun shop owner recalled Muhammad purchasing ammunition. A restaurant employee remembered serving them on multiple occasions. Scott was building a strong case, but she knew she needed ballistics evidence to make it bulletproof. She contacted the FBI laboratory and requested that bullets from the Tacoma shootings be compared to those from the Beltway attacks. If they matched, it would provide the concrete proof she needed. While waiting for the ballistics results, Scott continued gathering evidence. She tracked down Mohammed's military buddies, his ex-girlfriends, and anyone else who might have information about his activities. The picture that emerged was of a man consumed by rage and bent on revenge against American society. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Scott discovered that Mohammed had been in contact with other extremists during his time in Tacoma. He had attended meetings of a local group that promoted anti-government and anti-American sentiments. He had expressed interest in joining terrorist organizations and had made inquiries about obtaining more sophisticated weapons. These connections suggested that Mohammed's motives went beyond personal revenge. He saw himself as part of a broader war against American society, and he was using Malvo as a weapon in that war. The teenager had been completely indoctrinated, transformed from a troubled kid into a willing accomplice in mass murder. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, the investigation was reaching a critical point. The snipers had killed 10 people and wounded 3 others. The entire region remained in a state of terror, with schools closed, outdoor events cancelled, and people afraid to engage in routine activities like shopping for groceries or filling their cars with gas. The pressure on law enforcement was enormous. Politicians were demanding results. The media was asking increasingly pointed questions about why the killers hadn't been caught. Families of victims were pleading for justice. The FBI and other agencies involved in the investigation were working around the clock, following up on thousands of tips and leads. But despite all the resources devoted to the case, investigators seemed no closer to catching the killers. The FBI's psychological profile had led them to focus on white male suspects, causing them to overlook Mohammed and Malvo completely. The search for white vans had consumed enormous resources, while the real killers drove around in a blue Chevrolet Caprice. It was at this critical moment that Scott finally received the ballistics report she had been waiting for. The results were exactly what she had hoped. Bullets from the Tacoma shootings matched those from the Beltway attacks. The same rifle had been used in both sets of crimes. Scott immediately contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and demanded to speak with the lead investigators. At first, they were skeptical of her claims. A small-town detective in Washington state claiming to have solved the nation's most high-profile case seemed far-fetched. But when Scott presented her evidence, their attitude changed dramatically. The ballistics match was impossible to ignore. It proved conclusively that the Beltway snipers had been active in Tacoma months before the attacks began in the D.C. area. More importantly, it validated Scott's theory about Mohammed and Malvo being the killers. Within hours, FBI agents were on planes to Tacoma, ready to take over the investigation and coordinate with local authorities. Scott found herself at the center of the biggest manhunt in recent American history, providing crucial information that would help lead to the capture of 2 of the country's most wanted criminals. The identification of Mohammed and Malvo as suspects changed everything about the investigation. Suddenly, investigators had names, photographs, and detailed background information about the killers. They had military records, court documents, and witness statements. They had a blue Chevrolet Caprice to look for, instead of white vans. Most importantly, they had a clear understanding of the killer's psychology and motivations. Mohammed wasn't a traditional serial killer or terrorist. He was a man consumed by personal rage who had turned his anger into a war against society. Understanding his motives would be crucial to predicting his next moves and eventually capturing him. The FBI immediately issued alerts to law enforcement agencies across the country, providing descriptions and photographs of Mohammed and Malvo. The media was briefed on the new developments, though investigators were careful not to reveal too much information that might help the suspects evade capture. But even as the investigation gained new momentum, Mohammed and Malvo were preparing for their most audacious attack yet. They had been monitoring news coverage of the investigation and knew that law enforcement was closing in on them. Rather than flee or lay low, they decided to escalate their campaign of terror. On October 14th, FBI sniper expert David Reichert was shot and wounded in a Home Depot parking lot in Falls Church, Virginia. The attack was particularly brazen because it occurred in broad daylight at a busy shopping center with heavy police presence in the area. The shooting of Reichert sent a clear message. The snipers weren't intimidated by the massive law enforcement response. If anything, they seemed to be enjoying the attention and the challenge of staying ahead of their pursuers. This psychological game playing was typical of Mohammed's personality and provided additional confirmation that Scott's identification of the suspects was correct. But the attack on Reichert would also prove to be a tactical error. The shopping center was equipped with sophisticated security cameras that captured images of the blue Caprice in the area around the time of the shooting. For the first time, investigators had concrete evidence placing the suspect's vehicle at a crime scene. The investigation was entering its final phase. Law enforcement agencies across the region were now actively searching for Mohammed and Malvo, armed with detailed descriptions and photographs. The killer's window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and they would soon have to choose between fleeing the area or making a final, desperate stand. Detective Kathy Scott had provided the key that unlocked the entire case. Her dogged investigation of seemingly unrelated shootings in Tacoma had revealed the true identity of the Beltway snipers and given investigators the tools they needed to bring them to justice. The endgame was approaching, and it would come sooner than anyone expected. The capture of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo came not through a dramatic shootout or high-speed chase, but through the careful police work that Detective Kathy Scott had made possible. Her identification of the suspects had given investigators the crucial information they needed, but it would take one final piece of good fortune to bring the killers to justice. On the night of October 23, 2002, Muhammad and Malvo made a fatal mistake. Exhausted from weeks of evading capture and growing increasingly paranoid about the massive law enforcement operation hunting them, they decided to rest at a highway rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland. They parked their blue Chevrolet Caprice and settled in for a few hours of sleep, believing they were safe in the darkness. What they didn't know was that a truck driver named Ron Lance had been following the news coverage obsessively and had memorized the description of their vehicle. When he spotted the Caprice at the rest stop, he immediately called 911 and stayed nearby to keep the car under surveillance until police arrived. The response was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, dozens of police cars surrounded the rest area. FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and local law enforcement officers took positions around the suspect's vehicle. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights illuminating the scene. The two men who had terrorized a nation for 3 weeks were finally trapped. The capture itself was anticlimactic. Muhammad and Malvo were both asleep when officers surrounded their car. They were awakened by commands broadcast through megaphones and surrendered without resistance. After weeks of living on the edge, constantly moving and looking over their shoulders, they seemed almost relieved that their ordeal was over. Inside the Caprice, investigators found a wealth of evidence that confirmed everything Detective Scott had theorized about the case. The rifle used in all the shootings was hidden in the trunk, along with a bipod and scope. The trunk had been modified with a small hole that allowed the shooter to fire from inside the vehicle while remaining concealed. They also found maps of the Washington, D.C. area with potential target locations marked, along with newspaper clippings about the investigation and their attacks. Most disturbing of all, they discovered plans for even more ambitious attacks, including plots to bomb school buses and attack children at playgrounds. The psychological warfare aspect of their campaign was evident in notebooks and writings found in the car. Muhammad had been documenting their attacks and planning future operations with military precision. He had seen himself as a general in a war against American society, and Malvo as his loyal soldier carrying out orders. The interrogation of the suspects revealed the full extent of Muhammad's manipulation of the teenager. Malvo had been completely under the older man's control, believing that they were fighting a righteous war against an evil system. The psychological abuse he had suffered was so severe that it would take years of therapy for him to understand what had been done to him. Detective Scott watched the news coverage of the arrests from her home in Tacoma, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was proud of the role she had played in solving the case, but she couldn't forget the victims whose deaths had made the investigation necessary. 10 innocent people had been killed and 3 others wounded before the killers were finally stopped. The aftermath of the case brought Scott national recognition for her investigative work. She was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences and was featured in numerous news articles and television programs. The FBI acknowledged that her identification of the suspects had been crucial to solving the case, but Scott remained focused on the broader lessons of the investigation. The case had shown the importance of sharing information between jurisdictions and not dismissing leads from smaller police departments. It had demonstrated that patterns in violent crime could emerge across vast distances and long periods of time. Most importantly, it had shown the value of listening to victims and their families, even when their stories didn't fit conventional patterns. Scott had solved the case by taking seriously the seemingly random shootings in Tacoma that other investigators had dismissed as unrelated local crimes. The trial of Muhammad and Malvo revealed even more disturbing details about their relationship and crimes. Prosecutors painted a picture of a manipulative predator who had turned a vulnerable teenager into a weapon for his personal war against society. The evidence of premeditation and planning was overwhelming. Mohammed was eventually sentenced to death for his crimes, while Malvo received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The different sentences reflected their ages and the degree of control Mohammed had exercised over his young accomplice. The investigation also revealed other crimes that Mohammed and Malvo had committed during their killing spree. They had been responsible for robberies, carjackings, and other shootings in addition to the widely publicized sniper attacks. Their total victim count was higher than anyone had initially realized. One of the most chilling discoveries was that they had been planning to expand their campaign of terror to other major cities. They had discussed attacking targets in Los Angeles, Phoenix, and other metropolitan areas. If they hadn't been caught when they were, the death toll could have been much higher. The psychological profile of Mohammed that emerged during the investigation and trial confirmed many of Scott's initial insights about the case. He was revealed to be a narcissistic individual with grandiose fantasies about his own importance. He saw himself as a soldier and a prophet, fighting against a corrupt system on behalf of oppressed people everywhere. His treatment of Malvo was particularly disturbing. He had systematically isolated the teenager from other relationships and filled his head with extremist ideology. He had used a combination of affection and intimidation to maintain complete control over Malvo's thoughts and actions. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young people to manipulation by charismatic but dangerous adults. Malvo had been searching for guidance and belonging when he encountered Mohammed, and his desperation had made him an easy target for exploitation. For the families of the victims, the capture and conviction of the killers brought some measure of closure, but it could never fully heal the wounds left by their losses. The random nature of the attacks had made them particularly traumatic, as survivors struggled to understand why their loved ones had been targeted. The broader community also struggled to recover from the psychological impact of the attacks. For weeks, millions of people had lived in fear of an invisible enemy who could strike anywhere at any time. The trauma of that experience lingered long after the killers were captured. Detective Scott's role in solving the case had a lasting impact on her career and personal life. She became a nationally recognized expert on serial crime investigation and was frequently consulted on other high-profile cases. But she never forgot the importance of the basic police work that had made the breakthrough possible. In interviews years later, Scott always emphasized that solving the Beltway sniper case hadn't required advanced technology or sophisticated profiling techniques. It had required careful attention to detail, willingness to consider connections that others had missed, and the persistence to follow leads even when they seemed to lead nowhere. She also stressed the importance of trusting instincts while remaining grounded in evidence. Her initial feeling that there was more to the story than anyone realized had been crucial to beginning the investigation that ultimately solved the case. The case became a textbook example of effective police work and interagency cooperation. Scott's initial investigation in Tacoma had provided the crucial breakthrough, but solving the case had required coordination between dozens of law enforcement agencies at the local, state, and federal levels. It also demonstrated the importance of community involvement in solving crimes. From the truck driver who spotted the suspect's car at the rest stop, to the witnesses who provided crucial information about their activities in Tacoma, ordinary citizens had played vital roles in bringing the killers to justice. Years later, as Detective Scott reflected on the case that had defined her career, she remained humble about her contributions. She had simply done her job as a police officer, following leads and gathering evidence wherever they led. But by refusing to accept that the Tacoma shootings were unrelated local crimes, she had provided the key that unlocked one of the most important criminal investigations in American history. The Beltway sniper case would forever serve as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places and take the most devastating forms. But it would also stand as proof that determined investigators, working with careful attention to detail and unwavering commitment to justice, can ultimately triumph over even the most dangerous criminals. John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection on November 10, 2009. Lee Boyd Malvo remains in prison, where he has expressed remorse for his crimes and worked to understand how he was manipulated into becoming a killer. Detective Kathy Scott continued her career in law enforcement, eventually rising to become chief of detectives in Tacoma. She never forgot the lesson that the most important cases often begin with the smallest details, and that justice sometimes requires looking beyond the obvious to find the truth that others have missed. The victims of the Beltway snipers are remembered not just as statistics in a famous case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Their families continue to honor their memory and work to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. In the end, the story of the Beltway snipers is not just about two killers who terrorized a nation, but about the many people who worked to bring them to justice. Detective Kathy Scott's role was crucial, but she was part of a larger effort that involved thousands of law enforcement officers, federal agents, and ordinary citizens who refused to let evil triumph. The snipers had seemed unstoppable, but they were wrong. Through careful investigation, determination, and a refusal to give up, one woman and her colleagues had taken them down and restored safety to a terrified community. It was, in the end, exactly what police work is supposed to be about: protecting the innocent and ensuring that justice prevails.